Adding textures can be a lot more complicated than adding basic materials. In this lesson, we'll add some images to our materials and also a video, and add some procedural effects as well. That'll help us get a really cool result. But at this point in the process, I don't expect you to have any knowledge about any of those things. So it's probably going to be a little challenging to dive right into them. But I'd like you to follow along with exactly what I'm doing, even if it doesn't totally make sense just yet. And that's because in the fundamentals courses that you can take after this one, we'll dive really deep into how all of this stuff works so that you can create your own effects. The purpose of this part of the course, though, is just to show you what's possible. But if it feels a little bit overwhelming, don't worry, because that's how it starts out for everybody. Just follow along with exactly what I'm doing, and you'll be fine. So first, in the downloads for this course, I have a couple different images. One of them I'd like to apply to the game cartridge to give it some art. I'm going to choose this one, which is from one of our previous game projects called Eat Sheep, and has a character called Melvin and a character called Kale, and a couple other little sheep too. What I'd like to do is bring this into my material. So what I'll do, for this one, I'll just select my cartridge here, and I'm going to add a different material for this because I'd really like it to only apply to that top face and not the rest of the cartridge. So I'll click the plus button to add a new slot, click New, and I'll call this one Artwork, or Game Artwork. Then I'll zoom in here, and since things are a little bit slow with cycles, I'll head back to the material preview. Then I'll hit Tab to go into edit mode, 3 to go to face selection, and select just that front face. Go to the game artwork slot and click assign. Then I'll hit Tab and go back to object mode. To get an image into our node editor, we can add an image texture. Let's go to Add, Texture, and Image Texture. Then click Open. I'll navigate to the textures folder, and so that I can actually see which one I'm selecting, I'll go to the thumbnail view and choose Eat Sheep Title. That'll load that image right into this node, and then I can take the color and plug that into the base color of our principled shader. You can see that our color has indeed changed, but our image isn't showing up exactly how we want. That's because Blender doesn't really know how to take our 2D image and apply it to our 3D object. It doesn't really know how to make that transition, so we have to tell it. And the process of doing that is called UV editing. So with our cartridge still selected, and with our Eat Sheep Title node still selected, let's head over to our UV editing workspace. That'll load our image right into our UV editor on the left, and then we have our normal 3D editor over here on the right. I'll hit period on the number pad to zoom right to the cartridge. You can see it's jumped us into edit mode here. And so that I can see what I'm doing in the materials, I'll go and pan over to the right here and switch over to our material preview mode. So this left editor over here with our image is a 2D representation of our 3D object and how it relates to our image. So if we select everything with A, we can use a lot of the same hotkeys in our 2D editor that we can in our 3D editor. I'll select all of our vertices with A and just hit G to move them around. And this is any of the vertices that are selected over in the 3D view. So if I hit Alt-A to deselect everything, then those will go away. But for now, we just want to work with this front face, so I'll left click to select it. If I hit G and move this around, then you can kind of see what's happening. It's picking up the pixels right under this line here. So the reason we were just getting one really light color before is because it was super squished and it was in the wrong spot. So the magic button to reset this is in the 3D view. Let's go up to UV and unwrap. Now our 2D representation of that 3D face has the correct aspect ratio, but it's rotated wrong. So what I'll do is hit R and 90 to rotate it 90 degrees and then hit enter. Then I can just move this into place with G, S to scale, and position this however I want the image to appear on the face. Now, if yours doesn't come out with the correct proportions and things look a little bit squished, like that or like that, then chances are you need to apply the scale of your object. This is something we talked about a little bit in the basics, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the fundamentals courses. But if we hit Tab to go to object mode and go to our object properties, we can see that our scale is 111, which is awesome. But if I were to scale this along the y-axis, just like so, and our scale is not 111 anymore, if I were to try to UV unwrap this, hit U and unwrap, it'll say the object has a non-uniform scale, and the unwrap will operate on a non-scaled version of the mesh, which essentially means that we're going to get a stretched result. So I'll just hit Ctrl Z to undo that, and if you are getting a stretched result for whatever reason, then I'd suggest you go to Object, Apply, and Scale, and then try going into Edit mode and unwrapping. So this is looking good, but I think he's kind of hidden too much in here. So in Object mode, I'll select the cartridge, hit G and Y, and pop them out just a little bit. That way we can see Cal and we can see Melvin. And really, that's all we need to do to apply this texture. So let's head back to our shading workspace. Next, we're going to step it up a little bit and apply an animation to the screen. So let's select the console object, go down to the screen material, and let's bring in an animation instead of an image. I'll go to my file browser and show you what we're going to work with. It's just the CG Cookie logo intro. Now I could go through and add a texture like we did before, but I can also just left click and drag and drop this into the node editor. Then instead of plugging the color into the base color, which would work, I actually want to plug it in all the way down here under the emission. Because if you think about it, the colors that are coming from the screen really should be glowing. The base color is essentially what the screen looks like when it's off. So I'll take the color output of our animation here and plug it into the emission color. If you'd like, you can actually, before you do that, just play around with the emission color itself and see what it does. Then we also have an emission strength down here to change just how much it glows. But I'll set that back to 1, and again plug the CG Cookie animation into the emission color. We're going to have to scrub through our timeline to actually see this animation, so we need a timeline. Take the bottom left of our 3D view here, right where our cursor becomes a crosshair, left click and drag upwards, and that'll split our editor. Let's switch this to our timeline, and now we can scrub through our animation. But it's not refreshing automatically, so we actually need to go through and check auto refresh. This can take quite a bit of memory, so it's a good thing that it's off by default. But for this project, it won't be a problem. Now we can see this play back, and it's pretty cool to see this come to life like this. It kind of gets cut off at about frame 100 here and doesn't finish all the way. So we need to add more frames. Let's go down to our movie texture, go down to frames, and let's give it 200 frames instead. That'll let it finish all the way through. So things are looking pretty good, but they're a little bit stretched. And as you might have guessed, we need to use our UV editing again to fix that. But I also want to show you one other cool thing, which is how to make a pixelated effect. And we're going to need UV unwrapping for that as well. So let's go ahead and add that pixelated effect and then unstretch it later so we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Again, there's no reason at this point that you would know how to do all this stuff, but I just want to show you the possibilities of what you can do inside of Blender materials because I think it's really cool. And hopefully it'll get you excited to learn more and move on to the fundamentals. But for now, I'm going to add a procedural texture. Unlike an image or movie, which is made out of pixels, this one is made out of math. But don't worry, we don't have to actually do any math, we just need to adjust some values. It's just a computer-generated pattern. So let's hit Shift-A, go to Texture, and the one we're going to use is Voronoi texture. We can see exactly what this is doing if we take the output and plug it into the material output surface. So first let's look at the distance. We can see we have a bunch of dots, and I'd encourage you to play with some of these values. For now, I'll just increase the scale. The distance output gives us a cool blobby dot pattern, but we can also get a color output, which gives us a nice randomized set of cells, and we can also get a position output. And that's the one that we're going to use. But let's look at the color output for now. We can change the scale here, but we can also change the randomness. If I set this all the way to 0, then we'll get a nice blocky effect. And this is really close to the pixels that we're looking for. But unfortunately, they're just a little bit stretched. So let's go ahead and fix that. We can't go over to our UV editing workspace quite yet because procedural textures don't use the UV coordinates by default like the image and movie textures do. So we need to tell this texture to use the results of what we do in the UV editor. To do that, we need to add a texture coordinate node. Let's go to Add, Input, and Texture Coordinate. It's called a coordinate because it's telling the texture where on the surface of the model it should appear. And to assign the coordinates that we're working with in the UV editor, we need to take the UV output of the texture coordinate node and plug that into the vector input of the Voronoi coordinate node. Now we can see that it's stretched in the same way that the CG Cookie logo is stretched. If I take the UV and plug it into the vector of our movie here, and then look at the result of our shader, then we won't see any difference, because again, it's using the UVs under the hood already. The thing that I want to do here that's a little bit of a trick is take the position output of the Voronoi texture and plug that into the vector of our movie. That's what's going to give us the pixelated effects. Again, we'll cover exactly how vectors and texture coordinates and all this stuff works in great detail in the fundamentals of materials and the fundamentals of texturing courses. So I wouldn't worry about it for now, but if you're really curious, if we look at the UV output directly, it's actually just a color gradient. And you'll notice that it's a smooth gradient. If we look at the position output though, instead of being a smooth gradient, it's a stepped gradient. So when we use that instead, then we're going to get a stepped result. Then we can just change the scale to change how big our pixels are. The bigger the scale, the more pixels it'll appear to have. I'll go somewhere around maybe 100. And then to get rid of some of these lines in between the pixels, we need to go to the movie node and switch the interpolation from linear to closest. The reasons for that I really wouldn't worry about for now. Then let's go ahead and fix that stretching. I think the easiest way to do that would just be to look at the color output of the Voronoi texture. So let's plug that into the surface for now. Then let's go over to our UV editing workspace. Take that screen face, go to UV, and unwrap. Then we just need to make sure that these are completely square. And if we zoom in, then they do look square. So that's good, but now it's not going to be correctly mapped to our animation. So let's head over to our shading workspace again. And instead, let's just plug in the final result here. And then go back to our UV editing workspace. Then we can see this face applied to our texture. It looks like we need to rotate it 90 degrees, so I'll hit R and 90. Hit G and X to move it over along the X-axis. And maybe scale it up a bit. Then let's head back to our shading workspace. Now it looks like we need a few more pixels in order for all of the text to show up correctly. So let's just increase the scale until we have enough to actually read this. Maybe 150. That's looking pretty good. And now we get a nice pixelated animation. It is still looking a little bit stretched though, so I will go back to the UV editing workspace one more time. Take our face here, hit S and X, and scale this out along the X-axis until it looks a little bit more in proportion. Maybe scale it down just a little bit, and there we go. Alright, then let's head back to the shading workspace, and I'd like to add one more effect here, and that is those lines that you often see in some of the old school displays. So for that, I'm going to add another generated pattern. Let's hit Shift-A, go to Texture, and this time I'll use a wave texture. I'll place this above our movie texture. Maybe I'll give myself a little bit more space in the node editor here. And let's plug the result of the wave texture into the surface so we can see it. I'd really like this to use our UV coordinates as well, so let's take our UV output of the texture coordinate node and plug it into the vector of our wave texture. Alright, so it doesn't change a whole lot, but at least now all of these textures are working within the same space. Then I can change the scale here, but I'd really like these to be horizontal lines rather than vertical ones, so I'll switch from X to Y. And there we go. As we change the scale, we'll change how many lines we're getting. If you want, you could also increase the distortion if you want these to break up a little bit, but I'll leave that at 0. Now I just want these lines to influence this movie texture. I'd like all of the parts where the lines are black to not be emitting any light. So what we can do is use a color and mix node and do an operation which will give us just that effect. So let's hit Shift-A, go down to Color, and Mix RGB. Another reminder that we'll talk a lot about how this all works in the fundamentals of materials and shading. Now we'll take the color output of the wave texture, put that into the color 1, the color output of the movie, and put that into color 2. Then I'll take that final result and put that into the emission. Then finally, to see the raw output of this mix shader, I'll take the color and plug that right into the surface. Now if we take the factor all the way to 0, then we'll get just the lines, and if we put the factor to 1, we'll get just the movie. But really, I just want those lines to darken the movie. So for that, I can use the multiply operation, which is a blending mode that you'll find in Photoshop or any video editing software. And there we go. Now those lines are completely black. Then I'll take the output of my principled BSDF and plug that into the surface. There we have our final result. Let's see how this looks in cycles. Let's head over to our rendered preview. I'll move my screen until there is a highlight over it. And one thing that I found makes this look a little bit more like an old school display is to take the roughness up just a little bit, till it spreads over more of it, and go down to the clear coat, which is essentially just a second layer of reflections, and turn that all the way up. So now we have a very soft highlight as well as a really sharp one. It's kind of hard to see, but that was definitely the experience of using those devices. So that's it for the materials and shading. Actually, as I was recording, it started raining really hard outside, so maybe you can hear that, maybe you can't, I don't know. But for now, let's go ahead and call this a day, and then in the next video, we'll finish things up by adding some lights and rendering it out.